Hello, my name is Caris Knighton. I'm an artist from Porthcawl, now based in Cardiff, and a PhD student in Cardiff University and the University of Bristol, funded by the South Western Wales Doctoral Training Partnership. I create artwork based on both my PhD research into the history and representations of manic depressive illness and from my own experiences of living with bipolar disorder since childhood. For my part in the Bipolar Awareness Project with the Royal College of Psychiatrists Wales, I decided to focus on trying to depict the experience of sensory hypersensitivity and bipolar disorder. I think misconceptions around bipolar often oversimplify the condition, and so I think it can be useful to create work around the experiences of some of the specific symptoms and complexities of living with bipolar. Feedback on my past work has suggested that sensory hypersensitivity is something that many people with bipolar experience, but is maybe one of the aspects that isn't talked about quite as much. So my 4 pieces in this project are one large ink pointillism drawing, pointillism being a technique of layering thousands of individual ink dots to form textures, and 3 pieces made with a combination of clay, driftwood, dried flowers, and feathers. Pointillism is the technique I've mostly used in creating artwork in the past, but clay was something that I started to work with during the first lockdown period last year. The news of the pandemic and the circumstances of the pandemic and that position we all had of this kind of specific ongoing experience of place all contributed for me in kind of increased waves of panic and an exacerbation in that sensory hypersensitivity. For me, I have my difficulties with auditory hypersensitivity in particular, but also with vision and lighted movement and with touch. So I've tried to film the different pieces in a way that both shows the different aspects of the pieces in as much as is possible virtually, and also in a way that hopes to capture the kind of discomfort, uncertainty, and sort of unnerving fog of sensory difficulties. So first of all, the pointillism drawing. One of the things I love about working with pointillism is that I will start by sketching out a very kind of rough and imprecise pencil guide, and then going in with building ink dots, I can just let the textures kind of lead me through the drawing and just feel my way through it. I love the duality between the up-close view of the individual points or dots and then that alternate view of texture when you step away from it. But during the start of the first lockdown, I was just really struggling to sit down and draw, and I just couldn't find my way through drawing. And so this pointillism piece was actually the last piece I worked on for this project. And initially I wanted to try working in a different way, and in a way that was kind of more tactile and that had some sort of grounding sensory experience. So this is a time lapse of the first piece that I worked on for this project, centered around the hand and touch. I decided to try working with air drying clay and combining the clay with pieces of driftwood, feathers, and dried flowers that I was experimenting with kind of shaping and drying into specific expressions. As I mentioned at the beginning, my sources for this project are both my own experiences and also my PhD research into 19th century representations of manic depressive illness. For this research, I examined case notes in hospital archives and medical journals, and I also analysed literary and visual representations. The goal of the research is to examine the relationship between representations in different types of texts, to analyse both developments in medical classifications and in social perceptions. Notes in patient cases in the 19th century include observations of sensory hypersensitivity alongside emotional states. And alongside these medical case notes, I also examine Edgar Allan Poe's short story, The Telltale Heart, first published in 1843, which depicts heightened sensory activity alongside states of mood. A central feature of this short story is both the sound and feeling of a beating heart, and this is a part of the basis for this piece, which is also centered around a heart, and which reflects on both my work on the Poe text and also my experiences of that feeling of sensory overload and that sort of fight or flight state that your body goes into, that panic alongside what feels like a smothering of sensory activity. It's like the other clay pieces in this project, I wanted this to have a sense of being kind of like a specimen that had been preserved, like those in anatomical museums. My source for this is mostly the Surgeons' Hall Museum's collections in Edinburgh, where I've spent a lot of time while being in Edinburgh to research the archival records of the Royal Edinburgh Asylum in the Lothian archives. For all of these clay pieces, I wanted to draw on that feeling of being kind of a piece of preserved body in a museum collection, but to include both the structures of the human body and external bodies of the natural landscape in the form of feathers, driftwood, and flora, so that there's both a lifelessness as well as something kind of organic and still growing. This experience of sensory hypersensitivity has both so much energy from that sensory experience, but then also a disconnect where it is so consuming that it also feels like you're kind of shutting down. It's that disconnect between being able to hear, but what you're hearing is not translating into understanding. It's like you're receiving this sensory information in a way that is so abrasive that it's impossible to navigate it and find meaning. For this piece, I wanted to try to depict what that experience feels like, and I wanted the line between organic and inorganic to be kind of unclear. I used my face for the basis of creating it, so I took wire and sort of shaped it around my jaw, neck, and up to my cheeks, and then having fitted that into the wood, I used a mirror to shape the rest of the face structure with clay. And I was thinking about, what if those sensory receivers are there, but everything that kind of makes it make sense is just sort of scooped out? What are you left with? What does that look like and feel like? So I wanted to dry and shape flowers to depict particular expressions in sensory function, to have a blurring between organic and inorganic, where the movement of the stems and leaves is indicating that internal connection between sensory receiver and processing it as information, but that connection is kind of bluntly cut off. So these 4 pieces then reflect on representations of sensory hypersensitivity alongside severe emotional states in 19th century medical cases and literary representations, and also try to depict my own experiences of sensory hypersensitivity and bipolar illness. Images of these pieces are also currently being displayed on the screens during events in the Mental Health Foundation's Green Ribbon Arts Festival, with the festival discussing the difficulties faced by the arts because of the pandemic, and including art created from experiences of mental illness during the lockdown periods. The pieces together hope to depict different aspects of experiencing sensory hypersensitivity across sound, sight, and touch. From the fight or flight state to the inability to process sensory information to this feeling of discomfort and recoil in the neck, which is where I feel like that physical discomfort kind of gathers for me, with that feeling that my neck is kind of distorting and straining as that sensory difficulty intensifies. I wanted these pieces to reflect on the experience of what can be some of the day-to-day difficulties and complexities of bipolar illness, and to try to portray what these moments feel like in different parts of the body, by recreating parts of the human body in clay and ink, alongside other bodies and structures of the natural world in the driftwood, feathers, and flora. So thank you very much for listening. Diolch o galon.
Okay, so hello, good afternoon. My name is Ethan Dodd, a visual artist from Wales, and I was asked to be a part of the Bipolar Condition Awareness Project with the Royal College of Psychiatry Wales. In my practice, I'm concerned with mental health and masculinity, and I have done a lot of work with my own depression and my own mental health issues. So I found a project such as this really interesting and engaging for me because I felt that it would give me a chance to learn more about bipolar and also to translate some of my own experiences with mental health issues into new artworks. So in my own practice, obviously I'm concerned with masculinity and mental health, and I'm really interested in ideas of mirrors and reflections as a way of translating personal experiences or the experiences of others into artworks, which hopefully will share and provide understanding and knowledge to the public and to other people who come to view the work. This has developed over years into a kind of semiotic language. Now, semiotics obviously, is the study of symbols and their meanings. And in darker times, I've made a lot of work about ideas of the self and how to understand the self. So I felt that I was able to translate meanings and research into kind of very interesting collaged artworks. Here's a series of works that I've worked with in the past, focusing on collage and focusing on the ideas of collage and the idea of connections between imagery and text and feelings and memories into artworks. Just a close-up of that work here. Around this time, when I started to do the project, I was really interested in medieval imagery. I find medieval imagery really, really interesting as a kind of language focused around traditional forms of myth or legend. And myth is a very important part of semiotics, and it's how we understand society as a whole, the human condition, and things like mental health issues or mental health conditions. And I also like the idea of things and not things, growth from mental health and mental health issues as a kind of journey, which some people have to take for the majority of their lives. Some people are able to do it for a short passage of the time. So when I was doing my primary research into this project, I was having a lot of conversations with Antonio Fabian and Oliver John, as well as Cerys Knighton, who has another talk and was another artist on this project. And through my discussions with Cerys, as well as my primary research into people who suffer with bipolar condition or disorder, I found this idea of the three characters or the three faces really pertinent to me. A lot of my work is informed by mythologies and informed by this kind of idea of phases or characters, and I wanted to bring that into this project. And these three characters are represented by the manic, which is the manic state, as well as the normal, the person as they are, and then the depressive, which, as we all know, depression is quite a prominent thing, but it's slightly different for people who suffer with a condition, as I found out through my research. And you can go between them, although there are two distinct types of bipolar, and one it suffers with the manic and some suffer with the depression. But it's very interesting and informative, thinking of it in a way in which it is one person who is split into three forms or three identities. So this also comes up a lot in mythologies with the idea of Janus and this kind of deity of transformation and transition, and Asura from Hinduism, who were angels, but they have different states of being. And I found this kind of idea really interesting to me, and I wanted to translate this into a form of artwork. Now, originally I was thinking of mirrors and this idea of painting onto mirrors, but it didn't quite fit with this idea I had of overcoming, well, maybe not overcoming, but learning to live with the condition and overcoming this kind of journey and experiencing the condition as a journey or a myth or a legend, which has a lot of benefits, I find, because of the ideas of transformation that are normally associated with myths. So at the time, I was also inspired by heraldic charges and heraldry, which was inspired by a conversation I had with my grandfather last year now. So this was just before lockdown. And I was really interested in these ideas of heraldry. Now, heraldry, and people probably know about heraldic charges, but they are a language that developed in medieval times as a way of translating the experiences of warriors or kings or towns or into a visual language, a semiotic language. And this was really inspiring to me, as I felt that it would align itself well with the work I've been doing, focusing around medieval myth and the idea of mental health issues, and translating them into a language that people come across quite regularly in their lives, even if they're not fully aware of it. And this kind of complex and symbolic language was super interesting to me. So here's an example of some charges here. And the important part to remember with heraldry is that the symbols that are utilized are a representation of the experiences of the person who's wearing them. So normally if something is emblazoned on a shield or banner, as they are with heraldry, it represents something symbolic in their past that they have either overcome or have studied or come into contact with and bested, to utilize medieval language, the idea of besting something. So I had this idea to create a kind of duality of shields or heraldic imagery. And I thought it would be interesting to showcase both the sides and both the characters or mental states of bipolar disorder through the depressive and the manic. And through conversation with Cerys Knighton, we kind of discussed imagery and metaphor that she had come across in her own research that I could translate into artworks. So at this time, as I had more experience with depression in my own life, I thought this would be a good place to start. And I started to look at ideas of the dog as we talk about the black dog as a metaphor for depression, Ki D, and this idea of translating that as a metaphor for the experiences or as a metaphor for this kind of character or state. And at this time I was looking at heraldic imagery. Here we have water, which obviously represents the state of mind, it represents consciousness, and the dog represents depression. But also the dog in heraldry can represent loyalty, but can also represent courage or vigilance. And I was really interested in this kind of color scheme of white, black, and blue. And blue represents loyalty and faith. Silver is peace and serenity. And black is constancy or grief. So I thought as a color scheme, this would work really effectively for the depressive state if I was trying to translate it into a heraldic charge that might hopefully represent the journey that people who learn to live with this condition go through. So at this time, I was also interested in symbolism that kind of came from at this point and this kind of medieval history and this kind of symbolic language that I had started to develop in my own practice, but which could be developed in a new, exciting direction as part of this project. So this idea of the remnants of a journey or the remnants of a myth being a way of translating the experiences of people who live with a bipolar condition into artwork was super interesting to me. So as here we see a selection of images, which I will show in the final design in the next few images in the next slide now. But I just want you to have a quick look at these before I move on, and I can explain the symbolism in each of the images and symbols here. So here is my flag, very beautifully modeled by my friend Beth. And this design took a lot of work and came to me after a lot of research and a lot of kind of experimentation. And here the color scheme comes back again, blue, black and silver / white representing loyalty and faith, peace and serenity, constancy and grief. The dog, courage, vigilance and loyalty. Chains represent a weighty service, as in bonded to a chain of obligation, almost like an idea of being bound to something. But I wanted to symbolize the chains as being broken as a reference to being freed. Traps and weight here represent ideas of feeling low or feeling trapped in the state, but the idea of breaking it, possibly through the healing powers of water, was really interesting to me. We also see aspen leaves here, and aspen leaves represent determination as well as overcoming of fears and doubts, which I thought was very prominent and very necessary for this work. Unfortunately, with the COVID pandemic, I haven't been able to take photos of these works in the most appropriate light that I would want to, but I thought that to show them in a space such as this, in a residential space, would kind of give them a more personal and intimate expression through the material and the work itself. So as I hadn't had much experience with manic depression or the manic state, this was a bit more challenging for me, but I found it quite interesting because I found this idea of the passion coming through in the work. So here, I was inspired by this idea of raising up or transcendence, or this idea of flashes of energy. I found when I have felt jubilation or great passions of energy, I find myself feeling like I could take on the world, for example, without consequences. And through my research, I found that that was quite a universal experience of people who suffer with bipolar condition, and specifically that condition which creates the character or the state of manic and depression or mania in them, which I found very, very interesting. So this idea of heaven as a representation of the mania state was something that kind of stuck out to me from the beginning, and also is something that is obviously very prevalent in medieval imagery, and the idea of heaven and godliness and transcendence. So I wanted to evoke something beautiful and precarious in the piece, which I think is represented here in the work in the next few slides. So here's some close-ups here. With further communications with Cerys Knighton, we'd spoken about the dog for the depressive state, which was aptly titled Blue Day. And I wanted to create or utilize a metaphor or a symbol for the mania, the manic state. And Cerys Knighton informed me that in the past, orangutans or primates were often used as a metaphor for this because of the fact that they had been used in experiments or research in the past, focusing on this condition. And I found this idea really stuck with me, and the idea of kind of an energetic entity or being existing as a representation of this, the kind of idea of the primate just stuck and felt very personal and intimate to us as humans. Here's a close-up here. So we have the primate here with some of the symbolism represented in the work, which is just a small piece of detail here. And I've included little drawings here and there to provide a visual language to the work and a visual language to the presentation. This idea of passion, I didn't know how to, I wanted to be careful and considerate with my wording of this work. And I thought the passion really stuck out to me because it felt like a positive thing, something that is something to be celebrated in everybody, and especially people who suffer with the condition. So here, unfortunately, no one is modeling it here, but this piece, Orange Day, was really interesting to me. And the symbolism here, as previously mentioned, there's a lot of symbolism in the color scheme, in the imagery, in the metaphor. So the yellow here, which would represent gold in heraldic charges, would represent generosity and elevation of the mind, here representing transcendence or a heightened sense of awareness, as well as orange representing ambition, and red representing warriors. Here it's more of a pink because I wanted to soften the brightness of the red and provide a more exciting and engaging artwork. So I utilized a kind of off pink, a bright pink. We also have the primate representing energy and enjoyment. Azaleas represent temperance and passion. Lightning, flashes of power, flashes of energy and swiftness, which is also represented in the wings as well, which have glory and splendor. Fire represents zealousness, and the sun represents a fountain of life, or glory again. I was really interested in showcasing a completely different emotion for each of these heraldic collages. And I was thinking about making shields at first, but I thought that the banners were more fitting. They felt like they could be hung in an intimate space such as this, or inside of an exhibition or a gallery, or even hang outside, and they could act as representations and flags or banners to a better understanding and a better communication and connection with people who live with the condition, as well as people who are members of the public. And I hope that when they are finally shown, people will understand the meaning behind them, as well as appreciate that the people who live with this condition, it is a challenge, but they are greater people for it. And I hope that makes sense. And it was lovely to speak to you. So thank you very much.